David, who should stand still on some of our major highways will have another hazardous waste that they didn't have a right to stop me from mowing my lawn.
Good afternoon. My name is Bree Watts. I'm a student of Daniels. I'm here today to invite you all to start the day as I start the day every day in our classroom, which is with the community candle. I would like you all to close your eyes if you would like to. Imagine all of those whom you've lost to violence of any kind, and all of those who have gotten you to where you are right now, and look in the mirror that has just popped into your mind and smile at yourself because you're beautiful. Now, I want you all to reflect on who you are and the people who have helped you get there. And on the count of three, we can all say, "I ate den." 1, 2, 3. I ate den.
Give it up for my student, Brittany Watts. My name is Daniel Gray-Kontar. I'm an educator, I'm a poet, I'm a youth activist, I'm a mentor, and I'm a father. And I'm also a 45-year-old black male youth. I haven't forgotten at all what it was to be a young person. And I think that to be a teacher, I think you need a little bit of that inside of you, at least to be a relatively effective one. And that's really important in this time. Why did we start with what we call the community candle? We started with it because it's the way that we start our classroom each and every morning. I've had the opportunity to teach in Oakland, California, and now in Cleveland, Ohio. These are two of the most violent cities in this country. One of the things that I find that's pretty much consistent with both groups of youth in both cities is that there's rarely ever time for self-reflection. And self-reflection is one of the most important parts of any education. And we don't do a whole lot of that in schools. Heck, we don't do a whole lot of that in our own personal time. So it's important for us to engage in that process of self-reflection. This is important, especially in this time where there's so much going on in our city. My job today is to invite each and every one of you into room 201, which is my classroom where I teach creative writing at the Cleveland School of the Arts. So my job is to teach young people how to write poetry, plays, short fiction, screenwriting, anything that's creative writing. That's my job. But I do a lot more than just that. What I endeavor to do is to transform youth voice so that our youth can begin to be seen and to see themselves as participants in our democracy. That's my job. It's not in my description, but it's what I do. I think it's what schools need to do more of. I want to show you the story of room 201 and how we endeavor to do precisely that. So if you give me 15 minutes of your time, it's all good. Can we say "all right then"? That's what I'm talking about. So let's begin. As a teacher at the Cleveland School of the Arts, and as a pedagogue, what I'm trying to do is bring my own research interests into the classroom. So I want to unpack what some of those research interests of mine are. First of all, I'm interested in schools as sites and primary sites of struggle. Now, what do I mean by that? What I mean is that schools are the first place that you come into contact with an institution that is supposed to help you develop your voice. The second thing that I'm really interested in is the language that we use to understand youth. It's very interesting language. And there's a history behind that language. I'm going to call those discourses instead of languages. The third thing I'm really interested in is unpacking and developing urban youth in schooling institutions to become three things: agents of self-empowerment, agents of self-transformation, and actors in our democracy. Last thing I'm interested in is how can we take those things that we try to teach in schools and translate that into youth working and acting in our communities. Not in the future, but in the now. So that's what I'm interested in. Let's deal first of all with what I mean by schools as primary sites of struggle. So there's tension in schools all the time. Students against teachers, teachers against students, teachers against administrators, students against administrators. Everybody's got their own agenda. The students' agenda is to learn more about themselves, to learn more about the communities that they come from, to understand their place within the context of that community, and to understand themselves deeper so they can possibly become actors. That's what they're interested in. They may or may not articulate it in those terms, but that's what they're interested in. Teachers are interested in something a little bit different. They're interested in teaching what they're told that the student is supposed to know. They teach to a test, increasingly. So those are interesting dynamics that you have there, and they often create tension. I'm interested very much in that tension, and so are my students. I want to tell you a story about one of them. Her name is Alicia McCoy. Alicia McCoy was 15 years old when she first learned in my classroom that she has these things called human rights. She didn't know she had those. So then she decided to figure out, what are those human rights? There are 30 of them. But there's one in particular that she was really interested in. She was interested in education as a human right. She then started to ask herself a question. What is education? In fact, what is education to me? And how is it different from schools? It's a fascinating question. It took her a whole year to really unpack it. Here's what she found. She said, schools are meant to indoctrinate you. They're not meant necessarily to educate you, but to indoctrinate you, to give you what it is that they think that you should know. Not necessarily what I need or want to know, but what they think I need to know. She says this, what's education to me? Education would suggest that the student create their own theories. These theories are based upon what they have learned, and it then allows them to create something that makes sense to them. That's how new theories are constructed, by questioning the old ones. This is her thesis. This is what she came up with after a year of study. Made perfect sense to me, and it unpacks schools as places of struggle, as primary sites of struggle. What she wants to know, needs to know, what the school is actually teaching her. Did a brilliant job. I want to talk just a little bit more about schools as primary sites of struggle, and how I want to talk about it is by looking at what we do in room 201. I want to guide you to take a look at the slide in the center. This is what room 201 looks like. Room 201 does not look like rows of desks or chairs or tables, and me standing in the back as the master. It doesn't look like that. What it looks like instead are several bean bags, chairs, couches, no overhead lights, lamps. In other words, we've deconstructed power. We're all in it together. I'm not talking down or teaching at, I'm talking with, in a circle, where we all are equal participants. And the place looks like their home. It doesn't look like some foreign place that they enter. This is the essence of deconstructing power, by changing and rearranging the very, very space. This is very John Deweyan. Next thing, we talk about power. So not only are you in a place where power is deconstructed, physically by being there, but to actually talk about power, to talk about its archaeology. What is oppression? What is liberation? Who has the power to oppress? Who has the power to liberate? What does liberation look like? These are conversations that need to be had inside of a school with students who are seeking, supposedly, to empower. We then, since I'm teaching creative writing, unpack power within the context of writing. What is an author? From the Latin authority. What does that mean, author? What's the relationship between the author and authority? When authority is to increase, what are you as author increasing? These are conversations we have about power. Schools are primary sites of struggle. Next thing I'm very interested in is the history of discourses and why we look at youth the way that we look at them. Well, we've all been youth. It's funny. But somewhere, our perception of youth, even though everybody in this room has been a youth, it changes. How does that happen? Let's unpack it just for a bit. What I want to do first is think about something called the hidden curriculum. Now, the bell didn't go off, but there's a sound that each and every one of you in this room is very familiar with. It's the sound of a school bell. It is the most, or one of the most important sounds that you'll ever remember, because you come into contact with it every day while you're in school. That bell, I would submit, is part of what's called the hidden curriculum. Now, if you look at the slide above me, you'll see that curricula are written, they're assessed, and then they're taught. So, social studies, math, science, English, your curricula are all developed in this way. But there's also a hidden curriculum. It's the things that you get that weren't intended by the curriculum. The school bell is one of those things. It's part of the hidden curriculum. It tells you when to go, when to arrive, and if you're late, there's certain consequences for that. It's a part of our daily lives as students, and you all remember it. But where did that bell come from? Who designed it? Who gave us that mnemonic device? Well, before I answer that question, I want you to take a look at a couple slides just above me. These are classrooms. The bottom one is a classroom in 1903. Then there's a classroom in 1965. Then there's one in 2014. Doesn't look very different, does it? We haven't really changed the way our classrooms look, even though our society's changed a lot. But this is what I want to next do. Let's keep the slide from 1903, and let's put it beside something else. One of those slides is of a classroom. The other one is of an American factory. That's where the bell comes from. The bell is part of the hidden curriculum, which indicates that you are to be transferred from a factory to a school. This is the school to factory model of American education. It's part of the hidden curriculum. It's what our students engage in even now. If you go into a classroom, it doesn't sound or look too much different than in 1903 in this respect. It's part of the hidden curriculum. But why was this important in the 1900s? Because we perceived of our youth as problems to solve, but not as answers to the questions of community. Let's unpack that very, very quickly. 1910 to 1920, what happens? Youth arrive in record numbers from Europe and from rural America. They arrive into urban cities in America. There's all of this youth. Oh my God, what are we going to do with all of these youth? There's so many youth. What are we going to do? So there's this whole discourse that emerges around the youth problem. You couldn't open a magazine, couldn't open a newspaper without everybody talking about the youth problem, youth problem, youth problem, but never were those youth or their parents asked, what do you need? How can we support you? What should your curriculum look like? No. Instead, what we did was try to control them and those communities. This was called the social efficiency model of schooling for urban education. It was about social efficiency, social control. We develop your curriculum for you. We don't talk to you about that. Question, is that democracy? Is that system of education democratic? I venture to say that it's not. Our perception of youth scarcely has changed to the contemporary moment. Here in Cleveland, whenever you pick up your newspaper and whenever you see a lot about youth, you're going to see them portrayed as problems to answer, problem to solve, particularly urban youth and youth of color. They become the other. We otherize them in our discourse. We create what's called a system of inclusion and exclusion. There's a discourse created. That discourse becomes fear. That fear and discourse of fear becomes truth, and we recycle it over and over again. That becomes what we call the collective psyche of the more privileged, where our discourse dictates what happens. Meanwhile, there is a collective psyche of the less privileged who do not have an opportunity to engage in the discourse and are not asked. They instead say a simple phrase after having not being asked. And we've all used it. It is what it is. Let's unpack it is what it is. It is whatever the dynamic is. Is that dynamic exists? What it? It's the second if now has power grafted on it. Is, once again, that power is not able to be determined, controlled, or sorted. It is what it is. In other words, I have no power to change the circumstance. What I try to do in my classroom in room 201 is not look at it is what it is, but get my students to say it is not what it is. That's education. Teaching our youth that they have the power to transform their circumstance, not to simply say, it is what it is. Are y'all with me so far? Right on. So those are my interests. But my interest is also in developing my students as artists to be democratic participants, to engage in self-empowerment and social transformation. How do we do that in room 201? It's a four-step process. First, discipline through meditation. Now this is intense because oftentimes when we think about discipline, what we think about is the student does something wrong, we discipline them, they do it again, they come back, we discipline them again. It's punitive. It's not what I'm interested in. What I'm interested in is teaching my students how to be mindful. How do you become present and in the moment? How do you do that? How do you train yourself to do that? Because when you do that, you discipline you. And I don't have to do it. You do. That's a process. Our class begins with that. Once students begin to engage in the process of mindfulness, which is what the community candle is, that's why we do it every day. We then engage in a process of critical self-reflection and self-analysis. You ask the question, who am I? Why do I do what I do? What's my habitus? Why do I continuously do the same things? And how can I transform that? Critical self-analysis through writing. The next step, once you have a sense of who you are, at least some sense, you can then begin to understand where I fit within the context of my community. What is a community? What is my community? Why do I live in a food desert? What can I do to transform that? How can I analyze my community, study it so I can understand it, and understand my place in it? Then I can make art that seeks to transform that. Or I can be an activist to transform. Or I can be an artist activist, or what I call an artivist to transform my community, right? That's the process. How does that look in room 201? One of the most important things is the structure behind me. There are several layers. The outermost layer are man-made ideas: culture, gender, race, history. Man-made ideas. Just inside of that, man-made institutions: government, law, media, religion, the block you grow up on, the school, and your family, the first institution, but also media, which is so important. Man-made institutions, guided by man-made ideas. In the center is you. Now, at first, looking at all those structures, it looks insurmountable, that you can do absolutely nothing about any of those. Not true. Those arrows pointing inward and outward give us the sense that not only are we controlled by them, but we have the capacity to control them as well. This is what we try to teach our youth in room 201 by using that structure. The end result is art and democratic participation. What you see in that photograph there is the community candle in a very public space. It's Kennedy's at Playhouse Square. During their performance, they are reading poems in response to Tamir Rice. And they're inviting others to do the same. They continue that by creating what they have now called the One Mic Open. It's an opportunity for youth all over the county to come and read poems in response to key community issues, and there are more than 500 of them that come to this. This is all organized by the youth. The poems are all written by them. The marketing is by them, all of it. So this is what I'm interested in. But the last thing, how can we begin to transform this kind of education that happens in schools to the community? I want to give you one example, and this will conclude my talk. This is the direction that, in my estimation, the school pipeline to community, how it needs to work. I got an email, and this is it, just above me. It's from the Oakland Youth Commission. I was no longer in Oakland, I was here in Cleveland. The email asked me if I had any youth who could sit at the table to help them choose the next police chief. I have never gotten that email from anyone in Cleveland. Never gotten it. Waiting for it. Part of the reason is our perception of what our youth can do and who they can be. Our charge is to get our youth to develop voice, to get them to see that they can be the answers to the problems in our communities. Not just in the future, because we all say the youth are our future. In the future and the present. Let's begin to ask them to come to the table. Not just to ask their thoughts, no. Come to the table to help solve the problems with the police review board. To help solve the problems of graffiti. To help solve the problems of food deserts. They have the capacity, they have the willingness, and they clearly have the drive. The question is, do we? Thank you.